Hello everyone. So in some of the comments on my videos, I got a suggestion for what I could do next, and it came from Richard, which he wrote, "How about calling Florida deer with grunts, bleats, and horns? I heard or read somewhere that Florida deer don't respond like up north." Now, I do listen to a lot of the podcasts, and this topic comes up fairly regularly on podcasts, and a lot of times they're comparing areas like Michigan to the Midwest of like Iowa, Indiana, things like that. And in these podcasts, their take on it is the highly pressured states like Michigan, these deer don't respond to calling as well as in areas that have much lower pressure, a little bit higher deer densities like Iowa and throughout the Midwest. Now, how that can pertain to Florida is, well, we all hunt public land, and a lot of this public land gets a lot of heavy pressure on that. And I think that's going to fall into a lot of like the Michigan areas where they're getting heavily pressured too. And I've seen in my own experience where there's some hunters out there who are really just going to these calls as almost their sole way of trying to get a deer in. One time when Roy and myself were walking out from our stands, we could hear from a long way off somebody just beating on horns. They had spare antlers and they're just going nuts with it, and almost non-stop. And as we kept walking out, clearly could see him off in the distance about 30 feet up in a pine tree just rattling away on this. And I think instances like this where people are using these calls in excessive amounts is going to numb the deer to responding them, definitely. And anytime some deer does respond to them and then ends up seeing a hunter or feeling danger from that, that's going to diminish it as well. The other thing to think about when using anything out in the woods is I try and be a little conservative with that, not overusing something, whether it's deer sense or calling. Now, I do carry a grunt call and a bleat can in my pack with me when I'm out hunting. I also carry a turkey call and an owl call, but I have a separate video on that you can check out on how I use those for deer hunting. I think that's some good information as well. For now, I'm just going to stick to the grunt call and the bleat can for this video. So there are two situations in which I used a grunt call and shortly thereafter I shot a deer. So I'll go over those. The first one is I was set up on a bedding area outside it. Also, there were some deer trails that came out of the area. I started hearing some movement inside the bedding area, and as I looked through the trees and the brush, I happened to catch a glimpse of a tan deer hide passing in a little opening there. I gave one little grunt off of my grunt tube and just sat back and waited. A minute or two later, nice 7-point deer came strolling out of the bedding area, just walking along the deer run that crossed in front of me. I tagged that deer that day. Now, he didn't come out of this area looking for what made that sound. And it definitely didn't deter him from coming in my direction either. I think more likely what happened is if he heard the grunt, he probably just associated that with some safety, other deer in that direction, and started moving out in that direction. This allowed me to get the shot and tag the deer that year. So you can use them being conservative and not necessarily spook them. The other situation in which I used a grunt call, and I feel it definitely had a direct impact in me getting the deer, and if I didn't use it, I may have not had the shot that I did. That deer is actually this guy here. Shot this guy in Ocala. High pressure, no restriction hunting area, not a bad deer. This guy's got some thick beams on him. He'd been running around there for a number of years. Now, how I came across the opportunity to get a shot at him, I did see him once during archery season. He was well off in the distance. Just caught a glimpse of him browsing on some brush. That general gun, opening day, I sat out most of the morning. I don't recall seeing anything, but around 11:30, suddenly something was moving out in front of me. As I watched the area, I caught a glimpse of this rack, because as a rack this big, it's the biggest part you see on them. And I saw it moving left to right in front of me, just outside the open area I was hunting on, probably around 100 to 150 yards out. As he was moving along, I reached down, I gave a grunt on my grunt tube, and watched to see how he reacted to it. He kept moving at just the nice steady pace, just beyond open visibility for him. As he was moving, he was coming up to an area that directly off to the left of me I had set up on this natural opening that stretched out at least 150, 200 yards. Great thing about a tripod is you can set up really in these natural openings well. And I knew the track that he was on, he was going to cross that area. So I raised my gun up and just watched down that lane, waiting to see for him to cross. Ironically, he stepped out of that lane and came to a complete stop. This day I was hunting with my 35. It doesn't have a scope on it. It's just iron sights. I drew a bead on him, surprised that he was still there for me to even get a bead on him. And as I sat there, I kept thinking to myself, he's still standing there. Why is he still standing there? I kept applying pressure to that trigger, waiting for him to leave, but before he could, the gun goes off, dropped him right there on the spot. Now, what was great about this is he didn't move. And as I thought about things, as the day went on after that hunt, excited for this deer, I thought, I wouldn't have had that shot on him unless he came to that complete stop and stood there. And as I thought about things, that is exactly the wind direction for that day. The wind was blowing from me down that shooting lane that day. I think he heard the grunt, continued around till he got directly downwind, and stopped to see what made that grunt sound, what deer was in the area from there. Many people have talked about this, of not blind calling with a grunt call, because the deer will go around downwind on you and try and scent you and bust you out that way. Fortunately, I actually ranged it. He was 104 yards out. I guess he hadn't scented me. I had good scent control that day. He stood there long enough for me to make the shot, tag the deer. So real quick, I'm just going to interject a few thoughts on hunting without a scope and just using your iron sights. Now, most of the areas I set up in are thick, heavy cover, and in this situation, that deer may come out and you'll have very little time to draw up on it and take that shot. With iron sights, you're focused on that deer and you're merely raising the gun in line with your sights. Your eye never leaves the deer. If you have a scope, your eye has to refocus in the scope, find the deer again, find the vitals, and take that shot. Now remembering, these deer are so close by, if you're doing a lot of movement in that, they may pick up this movement. It may alert them to it. Maybe it only stops them, but you don't want to be looking for them and trying to find them in a scope. Iron sights alleviates this, where you just drawing up on them and taking the shot. These experiences definitely show that even on high pressure public land, a grunt call can be useful. It can help you get a shot at that deer. But I caution everyone, don't overuse this. You're not going to pull a grunt tube out of your bag, give a couple grunts on it, and have some deer come running in on you. Don't use it to definitely attract the deer, but as a tool to maybe get them to stop. Get them to look, try and wind you so you can get that shot on them in an open area. Well, if I've cautioned you against using a grunt call too much, you may think I'm implying that deer aren't grunting out there a lot, and they are. And I've caught this on a couple of my cameras, my game cameras, and I'll play those for you right here, let you see what I've gotten on my cameras. All right, whenever I'm editing, there's always things that come up that I forget that I put in the video, so I'm going to add it in here really quick. So some of our grunt calls, there's a little band on the inside, and you can change it. You can change it from, a bleat to a young buck to a mature buck to a trophy buck. And, something I thought about with this, we have a lot smaller deer here. I don't know if the size of our deer are going to produce these deep grunts that you hear. And if you listen to this video, these grunts weren't really deep on these deer that were coming by. If you're happy with a 6-point coming out to take a shot at, be that small buck. Be a buck that can be challenged and beaten. If you sound like the biggest, baddest thing that's in the entire state of Florida, you may scare more deer away than really attract them in. So that's just something to think about. So as you can see, definitely the deer are out there. They're grunting as they go through the forest, particularly in search of does. Both of these situations, that was a buck in search of a doe. Things to remember with this, though, is that buck was on the move chasing that doe. So it wasn't in a stationary spot. And as you can tell, the tone of the grunt was a little different. It varied from grunt to grunt, especially in the second video. You could definitely hear sometimes louder, sometimes quieter, even though the camera wasn't necessarily moving about too much. So something that you could do to try and mimic this while in a stationary position is to grunt off to your one shoulder, left or right, starting either way. Then move out just about 45 degrees, grunt in this direction. Wait a little bit, grunt again here, and then grunt off in this direction. This will create the sound as if it's moving possibly, and kind of give that idea of a buck in chase of a doe. Same thing with kind of using the bleat. You maybe add a bleat in there, then the buck in pursuit. Do something like that. But by no means start back over 2 minutes later and repeat the same thing again. Be very conservative in your uses of this. Use it. Maybe it sparks some interest. Let that deer come to you. Don't spook them out of there by overusing the call. So of course the last thing, which I haven't really made mention of, is rattling. I have to say that I've never done any rattling to where I can account that it drew a deer in. Definitely the deer are out there rattling. I've gotten that on a couple videos. You saw that one there. Is really nice deer, locking horns. And I've done some rattling sometimes when I'm on a long all-day sit. Through the middle of the day, I'll do a little rattling. Sometimes even just before sunup, I'll rattle a little bit while it's still dark out. Try and start directing them towards me so they show up at first light. I've never done this to the point where I can attest that, 5, 10, even 30 minutes later, a deer shows up looking for what was going on with that rattling. So I have to definitely say I'm inconclusive on that. I think some of the factors in that is most of our public lands, we have a very low buck to doe ratio. So the buck doesn't have to go out and fight his way to find a receptive doe. He can let the other bucks fight over one doe, and he's going to run off with the many others that are out there. Now, those of you who've gotten permits for some of these really limited hunt areas that are out there, Rock Spring Run, Seminole Forest, places like that, places that only get a few weekends of hunting each year, I think these calls can be more useful to you in those areas than like Ocala, Tiger Bay, these areas that have unrestricted hunting for 6 weeks out of the year. I think people go out and use these calls too much, tends to, make the deer wary of them, and they definitely won't be as effective. But on these permit areas, I think you're going to have a better luck of using these maybe a little more and getting some results from them. Hope this was all helpful to you out there. Be sure to check out my video on turkey calls for deer hunting. I think that's something, I use my turkey call a lot more than I use the grunt tube or my bleat can, and I talk about that in that video, so check that one out. We'll talk to you soon.